and welcome to another episode of the TF1 Show. I'm your host, Tinas Ferreira, the moose that keeps your hair straight and true in the turbulent wind that is the world of F1. Now, since we are once again stuck in the misery that is Sunday without any racing, I thought that I'd attempt to tackle a topic that has been discussed quite a bit over the last year and especially so over the past week: Sebastian Vettel. There is no denying that the four-time world champion is in a bit of a record slump, and today we will discuss his rise, his supposed fall, and whether there is a way back to the top for the man who couldn't stop winning 6 years ago. And I guess the best place to start is just to maybe have a bit of a think and to give a quick recap of what happened last week at the Italian Grand Prix, since I feel it's sort of been a turning point, or, well, I guess let's call it a flashpoint in Sebastian Vettel's career, especially given the context of, the mistakes he's been making over the past year or so. And I think we can all agree that when he went into the Monza race weekend, he was under a lot of pressure. He wasn't able to win a race this year up to this point. He still counts Canada as a race win, but he never won that race. And he also made a mistake there. So I guess for all intents and purposes, he didn't win the Canadian Grand Prix. But, all that aside, he hasn't won a race yet. His young up-and-coming teammate Leclerc won in Belgium the week before and was definitely the media darling, and then also the new darling of Ferrari, haven't provided them with the first race victory in a long time. And obviously they were going to Monza, which was Ferrari's home race, and it was their 90th year celebrations. There was just a lot of expectations, and I think a lot of expectations from Vettel himself to perform well at the Italian Grand Prix last week, especially also given that he has never been able to win for Ferrari at Monza. And then what ended up happening was he made the mistake. He spun coming out of the Ascari chicane without any, indication that it was going to happen, or without any pressure from any of the other drivers. He spun, then he got the 10-second stop-go penalty for the way he re-entered the track. And then to cap it all off, Charles Leclerc put in a gritty and forceful performance, one we've so rarely seen from Vettel himself, and he ended up winning on his first outing for Ferrari in front of the Italian crowd to massive fanfare and jubilation, holding off Vettel's longtime rival Lewis Hamilton for the majority of the race, and Vettel finished without even a point to his name in the race. And I've said this repeatedly on social media, and I think during my recap of the Grand Prix last week, that Monza was basically the perfect storm of disaster for Sebastian Vettel. I don't think it could have gone worse for him. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. And I feel this is sort of the pinnacle of what's been a very, very difficult 12 months for Sebastian Vettel. And then obviously in the broader context of his career, it's like quite a difficult stint at Ferrari from 2015 onwards. So I think what would be best now is to maybe take a step back and look firstly at how Vettel got to the top of the pile and what made him so good during those golden years at Red Bull. Now, in terms of his junior career, it was good, but it was definitely not brilliant. If you think about the likes of Hamilton, who won Formula 3 and then GP2 in his rookie year, and then immediately went into McLaren in 2007, or Leclerc, who won Formula 3 in his rookie year, Formula 2 in his rookie year, and then immediately jumped into F1. Vettel never had one of those seasons. He never actually won a championship in one of the junior single-seater categories. He was comprehensively beaten by Hamilton in their Formula 3 season together in 2005, and he did not win the F3 championship in his second year thereafter. He did, however, become the BMW test driver in 2006, and he really performed well during his testing sessions for the team. So he did a couple of free practice sessions, and obviously just those days a bit more testing was allowed. So he was able to actually really perform well relative to, the benchmark that was Robert Kubica and I think Nick Heidfeld at the time. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then when Kubica had the massive accident in Canada in 2007, Vettel was called up to race for BMW in Indianapolis the week thereafter, and that then became his Formula One debut. And he performed acceptably well. It wasn't incredible. It wasn't like, the birth of a star on his first outing for the team, but he did his job, and he did a solid job. And then what happened was Vettel was released at the end of July 2007 by BMW to join the Toro Rosso team, so the Red Bull Junior team, as a full-time driver, and he replaced, I think, Scott Speed there at Toro Rosso. And then he just completed the 2007 season with them, obviously with limited expectations given his lack of experience and his age. He was, I think, one of the youngest drivers ever to start in Formula One at that time. Then the 2008 season was inconsistent, but still a good season for him. And then the real sort of announcement that he made to the Formula One paddock was when he won the Italian Grand Prix, ironically, given what happened last week. But he won the Italian Grand Prix in the weights. He was the youngest ever pole sitter and race winner at the time. And it was a performance that announced himself to the world, and most importantly to Helmut Marko, the head of Red Bull's driver academy. I mean, then after that, things really started to progress quickly for him, where he was announced as the newest driver for the Red Bull team in 2009. And, from 2009 onwards, Red Bull became one of the most feared teams in the F1 paddock, with Adrian Newey being their chief designer, which then obviously meant they had a world-class car available to them at that point. Now, the 2009 season was the platform for Vettel to win the championship that he then ended up winning in 2010, 11, 12, and 13, which is still today one of the most impressive winning streaks in Formula One. I mean, if you think about the fact that at the end of 2013, he won 13 races in a row, which is a record I think he shares with Schumacher, but it still stands today. And that's incredible. Just that level of dominance that he had was very much unseen before and since, although you can definitely make a case for how Hamilton has been doing with Mercedes as definitely being rivaling that, or maybe even surpassing it. Now we need to ask ourselves, given everything that I've now just explained, sort of how he got from his mediocre, if you can call it that, junior career to the pinnacle of the sport in 2013 as a 4-time world champion. Why was he so good during that period when he was winning so much with Red Bull? And I think there's no denying that when the stars align, Sebastian Vettel is one of, if not the fastest drivers on the grid. And I think we can safely say that the stars aligned very nicely for Vettel at the beginning of his career at Red Bull. Now, I think the biggest part of this is just the car he was given to drive. Obviously, as I've mentioned, Adrian Newey, one of the top designers in Formula One history, was the chief designer for Red Bull. And what he came up with during those era of regulations was this concept of an exhaust blown diffuser, which effectively generated so much rear downforce in the car. And what that required from the driver was to actually keep the engine at relatively high revs during the corner in order to blow more exhaust gases onto the diffuser and therefore increase the downforce available to them in the corners. And well, firstly, Vettel was an absolute master at doing that. He really perfected the driving style that he required to optimize this sort of blown diffuser characteristic of the Red Bull at that stage. And then coupled with that was the fact that Vettel liked, and he still likes, a very stable rear of the car with high downforce levels throughout the whole phase of the corner. And the Red Bull was the perfect vehicle for him to be able to use that and basically just absolutely supplement his driving style and the way he liked to drive a Formula One car. And just this combined with the fact that Vettel was so good at using the blown diffuser and utilizing the blown diffuser meant that this set up an extremely effective recipe for Vettel to follow when he and Red Bull were at their best. What effectively this recipe is he had obviously the car that was the class of the field with the highest downforce levels and this incredible, exhaust blowing trick that nobody was able to really equal. I mean, most of the other teams tried similar things with their cars, but Nobody got it right the way that Red Bull and Vettel did. And what Vettel used to do is he'd obviously qualify on pole position. The Red Bulls were qualifying machines during that era. He'd put the car on pole, and then during the race, he would get out of the blocks as quickly as possible and get so far ahead during the first phase of the Grand Prix that it was nigh on impossible to catch him, especially on the high degradation tires of that era. And Vettel was absolutely the master of extracting that perfect lap in qualifying to blow everybody out of the water, and to then also put in a series of perfect laps right after the race starts to put him out of arm's reach. And I think we saw, hints of this at Ferrari as well. If you think about a couple of races in 2018, I think Canada is maybe a good example. There were a couple of races where he was very in tune with the car. He was able to put it on pole position, and then was so strong as a front runner that he can just, bound off into the distance and make it impossible for anybody to catch him. And this is really something that he was very good at during the Red Bull era. And Red Bull really allowed him to use this, you can't really call it a tactic, let's call it a strength, to maximum effect. And so I think that's definitely sort of what made him so fearsome during that era. Because I think it's worth mentioning that Vettel was never really the best at racing wheel to wheel and fighting his way through, equally matched competitors, if you can call them that. Some evidence to support this is the fact that he still has never won a race from a grid slot lower than third. But during those years, so from 2009 to 2013, he just never had to. It was very rare for him to start lower than third, which meant that if he wasn't on pole position to begin with, and for the majority of the time he only had to overtake two cars. And with the faster car, that was usually possible with strategy or, just the other cars not being able to make use of their tires as well as the Red Bull was able to. But the conclusion I think that we can draw is that Vettel is imperious when things are the way he likes it. And that's why Red Bull went out of their way to ensure that their star driver was never unhappy or upset. And then disaster and the inevitable fall from success, because in 2014, the rules changed and the engines changed. Gone were blown diffusers, and in were the new complex turbo hybrid engines, which Mercedes wisely spent years preparing for. The Red Bull Renault all of a sudden was no longer the class of the field, and everything about the car that Vettel was so good at using was no longer available because, and this is a very much underrated part of the Red Bull package when it was so dominant, is Renault was also able to build their engine and map their engine in a way that allowed this exhaust blown diffuser to operate at a very high level. Their engines were incredibly drivable and sensitive to driver input, which then obviously meant that Vettel was again able to use his uncanny ability to maximize the blown diffuser of the Red Bull. And now when the rules changed and the engine rules changed, all of that was out of the window because Renault was caught napping when it came to the new engine formula, and Mercedes were all of a sudden the absolute gold standard when it came to this hybrid technology and integrating it with the rest of the car. And that then also meant that the Red Bull all of a sudden was no longer the class of the field. And I think it all then everything then started sort of flowing from that point on, because then he had a new upstart teammate, Daniel Ricciardo, who was hungry to prove himself. And, before you know it, Vettel was done with Red Bull and he was on his way to Ferrari in 2015, where he wanted to emulate his hero, Michael Schumacher, and win the title there. Now, if you think about his time at Ferrari, it's definitely been a mixed bag, I think you can call it. Obviously now with the big slump over the recent 12 months. Because initially he had a few positive performances. You think about his first win in Malaysia in 2015. He had a good performance in Singapore a few times as well. The 2017, 2018 seasons at Ferrari, it was definitely moving in the right direction for him. The Ferrari had a very powerful engine and a car setup that seemed to suit Vettel really well. I mean, he won 5 races in both those seasons, I think. And then in Hockenheim last year, the wheels fell off the bus. I mean, that's when he had that accident there from the lead into the wall. It started a series of spins and other errors that were alarming in their regularity and also their nature. where he would spin his car whenever he was under pressure, and obviously in last week's case, just for no reason at all. Now we need to ask ourselves, what has led to this fall from grace? And let's start with the man himself. Now, there's no question that he's a brilliant driver with an incredible capability, but the post-Red Bull years have revealed certain weaknesses that were hinted at during those 4 championship campaigns, but were masked through him having the best car on the grid. And the first one I've already touched on, but he's not as naturally gifted when it comes to close combat and wheel-to-wheel racing. He can make an overtake stick, and he has made some very good overtakes, and I think it annoys me when people, especially obviously on social media, say that Vettel can't overtake. He can overtake, but he's not as naturally capable and gifted as some of his contemporaries that we measure him against. So when you put him against Fernando Alonso or Lewis Hamilton, even during his Red Bull days when they were racing wheel to wheel, we would put your money on Alonso or Hamilton to win that battle. I mean, obviously if you're in first place, as Sebastian Vettel was for the majority of that time, this doesn't really matter. But when during the course of a season you need to fight to come third or second instead of third or fourth, it seems like Vettel is just not the very best at being able to do that. And as I've mentioned before, his record of never winning a race from below third on the grid speaks to this. Just for a comparative, Hamilton has done so on 5 occasions, and Alonso has done it on 6. He's done it on 6 occasions, if I'm not mistaken, which just shows that those two they have a bit of an edge when it comes to fighting their way through the pack and making those critical overtakes to end up in a race victory, where Vettel is still a good overtaker. I mean, you don't get to Formula One, you don't win 4 world championships if you can't overtake at all, but he's just not quite at that level. And then the second thing about him is he's a very emotional driver. And again, this is not necessarily a bad thing, since Hamilton is also known to be quite emotional, but Red Bull used to be very good at managing this aspect of Vettel's life, and they ensured that the only thing he ever had to focus on was his driving. Now at Ferrari, this is definitely not the case, where Vettel constantly feels like he needs to manage the team as well as everything around him. What this also means is that while he can get on a hot streak, he can also fall away during races and seasons where things are not going well, and he can act slightly too rashly in those situations. A few examples being now when he has been spinning his car around, he can, just out of pure whim, spin up the rear tires of his car and cause, a lot of smoke and drama. And essentially, he's not seeing the bigger picture. He's purely acting on emotion and impulse. And that is something that can be a weakness of his. And then is also, I guess, something that used to be a weakness of Lewis Hamilton's, but recently it seems that it's less of a problem. Now, other than Sebastian Vettel's slight shortcomings or limitations that you can call it, the other issue that he has now is the car that he's driving is not to his liking. Now, the 2017 and 2018 Ferrari, they were cars that Vettel enjoyed, and you could see it in his results where, as I've said, he won 5 races in both seasons. Last year, going into the summer break, so halfway through the season, for Vettel and Ferrari were the odds-on favorites to win the championship, and if it wasn't for Mercedes beating Ferrari in developing their car, we could be having a very different discussion now, but alas, here we are. Now, the 2019 Ferrari has the fundamental problem of lacking overall downforce, especially at the front of the car. So the front wing is fundamentally not generating enough downforce for a multitude of reasons. But what it basically comes down to is, in order to compensate for this, the team is trying to load the front of the car as much as possible in order to compensate for the fact that the wing itself isn't generating enough downforce. And what that then has as an effect is the rear of the car, or the balance between the front and the rear, then means the rear is quite unstable, especially under braking and in cornering. And as I've mentioned right at the beginning, Vettel does not like rear instability. And the other problem is that Charles Leclerc, his teammate now, seems to be able to deal with it just fine, and a lot better than what Vettel is able to. And then what this means is Vettel is constantly uncomfortable in the car, and then this is exacerbated by the fact that his teammate is so comfortable with this and that is able to deal with it, because that then means is the offset between the two is larger, and that it can't be good for the confidence to see your teammates sort of handle the situation and you feeling uncomfortable consistently in the car and not being able to really extract the maximum from the car. And this then points to another perceived weakness that Vettel has, where he perhaps does not have the adaptability of his peers when presented with cars with different characteristics. Now, Fernando Alonso was famous for being a plug and play, if you can call it that, a plug and play driver, where you can put him in whichever car and you know he will be fast as hell. Hamilton is similar if you look at his 2009 season, where the McLaren he was driving was incredibly slow and was very difficult to drive. He still managed to drag results out of that car that the car didn't deserve. And Alonso actually noted this difference in an interview a long time ago. I can't remember the exact source, but if you are very well versed in the internet, you can go and find it. And even if you want, share it with me, and I'd be happy to share it with the world as well. Alonso noted this difference in that interview, where he outright claimed that he does not rate Vettel as highly as Hamilton due to the fact that Hamilton has this ability and flexibility to deal with a car that is not to his liking, where he, similar to Charles Leclerc, is very much able to deal with an unstable or twitchy rear end. And I think he actually prefers his car setup like that, which is something that Vettel doesn't like at all. Now, I think it is important to keep in mind that Vettel is not performing disastrously in his Ferrari, but you can definitely see that he falls into the Kimi Räikkönen and Jenson Button category of being very particular about car setup. If the setup is right, then he will go and blow everybody out of the water, but if it's not, then he will struggle. And now, I guess, now that we're nearing the end of this episode, we need to ask ourselves, can Vettel return to glory? And I truly think he can, but a few things will have to change and the stars will have to align like they did during his Red Bull years. So firstly, you will have to put in some very good performances against Leclerc over the remainder of this season. Otherwise, Leclerc will become Ferrari's championship hope. And he has already started establishing himself as being sort of the main, driver that Ferrari will be concentrating their championship challenges around. And I think he might still be a little too young for Ferrari to out and out say Leclerc will be their number one driver next year. But Vettel needs to make sure that he actually puts Leclerc in his place and reasserts himself as a driver and a force to be reckoned with. And I do think he has the ability. He just needs to somehow get his confidence back, cut out the mistakes, and start putting in some good, consistent results again. And then secondly, he needs to hope that Ferrari's design philosophy changes back to what it was last year or the year before, since he needs the rear downforce to give him confidence in the car. If Ferrari continues to persist with this high efficient, low downforce design that they had this year, but I don't think they will, given that it hasn't worked out very well for them so far. If they persist with this design philosophy, I think Vettel is just going to continue having problems and Leclerc is just going to become better and better, especially compared to Vettel himself. And because I think given the right equipment and the right mindset, Vettel is still a very daunting prospect and is an intimidating prospect. So he can potentially still challenge for a title next year if Ferrari gives him the equipment. And I think that will also maybe halt the challenge from Leclerc's perspective, because I think Vettel in a car that he likes better will definitely be able to give Leclerc a few more headaches. But if things continue the way that they are going, I don't think we are going to see Vettel in the car much longer. If the season continues to go in the way that it's been going for him, I think chances are good for him to retire at the end of next year, if not maybe even the end of this year. But I think that's still a bit of a long shot and a bit of a stretch. And that, ladies and gents, are my views on Sebastian Vettel and his current situation. I am, as always, happy to discuss this with anyone who disagrees with me, or of course with anyone who agrees with me. You can catch me on Twitter, where my handle is @TF1 Show, or on Instagram, where my handle is @the TF1 Show, if you want to continue the conversation. And luckily for Vettel, we are next heading to one of his favorite tracks in Singapore. Now, I can't wait to see the spectacle, and we'll chat again in a week's time.